So, with the 1965 Immigration Act now in effect, and again, this coincides with globalization by the 1970s, again, you see this pretty drastic recomposition of Asian America, in terms of ethnicity. You see more ethnic variation, new groups that'll come in post 65. If not just for previous groups that were here before 65, you see augmentation in numbers, and in most cases, drastic augmentation and enlargement. But you also see different things happening, like, different socioeconomic backgrounds. You'll see more professionals coming in, and we'll discuss all this. In fact, I introduced this in the beginning slide of this topic, contemporary Asian America. But also, again, a gender balance, no longer so skewed that we referred to in the first half of the class, right? When women were largely excluded, and so on and so forth. So, this again is such an important year. You can understand why 65 is such an important year, not just for Asian American immigration, but many other ethnicities, just the history of immigration in general. So now we can begin to discuss other groups in more depth, such as the Koreans and South Asians, Filipino immigrants, and other new groups. And when it comes to the Koreans, for example, we have to recall that this has a connection with U.S. militarism. Now, we introduced this term earlier with Southeast Asia, and in a sense, it applies to even the colonization of the Philippines, because let's recall the United States had sort of imperial design upon the Pacific region at the turn of the 20th century. And certainly by the end of World War II, some decades later, right, they were able to control Japan because it was defeated. And Korea used to be actually a colony of Japan. So what happens here is that Korea, of course, is given its independence, but the United States opens or installs military bases in Korea. So, in other words, U.S. militarism is a big part of the story of Korean immigration. It's not just the law, the 1965 Act. It's not just globalization when it comes to Korea. It's also partly explained by U.S. militarism. So I mentioned you see military installations in Korea, South Korea to be accurate. And at these places, you see American culture basically proliferating, spreading out, right, to South Koreans. For example, in the military bases, you see things like radio, right? A radio broadcast of American culture, American music, American news, English being spoken, in the American TV, the military TV station that they had. You had South Koreans able to pick that up, and therefore they got exposed to Hollywood movies, American TV shows, and more English, and just a depiction of American culture in general. So this exposure to American culture is going to make Koreans receptive towards migrating to the United States, especially with the 1965 Immigration Act. So again, you have to, just like Filipinos migrating to the United States, how they're shaped even before, migration. So to perhaps to a lesser extent, but Koreans are also shaped by U.S. militarism, even in their pre-migration lives. But certainly 1965 goes a long way to explain the augmentation, the enlargement of Koreans. So what we see here is again certain push factors, okay, behind Korean migration. And this really happens during the 60s, 70s. For one thing, South Korea was under the rule of a military dictator. Again, don't confuse this with North Korea. Okay, this is South Korea. They were actually under the rule of a military dictator. in the 70s, 80s. So many Koreans, South Koreans, I should say, felt that this stifled their chances for a better life. They wanted better college education, especially for their kids. And, it wasn't found in South Korea. They felt, even though there was decent education, they felt they could provide better, and just general lack of economic opportunity for them in Korea. So this compelled Koreans to consider migration to the United States, certainly after 1965. And indeed, that's what happens. You see the increase in Korean immigration beginning in the 1980s, really. Before 1980, you only had about 70,000 Koreans in the United States. And then by the year 1980, you see 354,000. And then by 1990, the 1990 census counted 800,000, roughly speaking. And then the latest census, which is 2020, of course, there were 1.8 million Koreans counted in the United States. So this is just a dramatic increase, as you can see. And we have to figure how um, chain migration is important to this. Okay, I just mentioned, sure, there's professionals coming over, sure, members of the educated class, but also what's happening is those original or initial immigrants, let's say migrating during the 80s, 90s, they're going to petition their family members to come over. Now, the family members might not be professionals like the original immigrants, right? They might not have the credentials, the education, the experience. So, because of this lack of, transferable job skills again, then they actually either become part of, more unskilled labor, or they enter businesses or small business, I should say, ownership. All right. And we'll discuss this in a minute. But chain migration, again, is a crucial part of Korean immigration. All right. Now, I just mentioned that they are known for entrepreneurship, small business operations. And you probably, if you've been to Koreatown in Los Angeles, you're probably aware of this, right? In fact, here are some depictions. These are more contemporary today, but Koreatown itself started as, these Korean owned shops, restaurants, small businesses, right? But what really grabs our attention here is the role of Koreans in what's known as middleman minority. Okay, Korean small business in low income neighborhoods. Okay, now think about this, and some of you might be familiar with this scenario. You have an economically depressed, low income neighborhood, let's say in Los Angeles. We're talking about maybe South Central, uh, which is comprised of African Americans, Latinos, and so forth. And again, they're low income. So you might be also aware that Koreans own a lot of the businesses. They're small businesses like liquor stores, small groceries, manicure, so forth, but they're there, right? So you may ask yourself, what are Koreans doing in these neighborhoods? How did they get there in the first place, right? Why Koreans? Well, this exactly explains the middleman minority role. This is a term by social scientists that study this. And as you can see by the term, it has middleman and minority put together. So, minority, they're obviously still racial minorities, right? And then think about middleman here. That means they occupied this middle position, this intermediary position. So, what are we talking about here? Well, these neighborhoods that are low income, they're comprised of racial minorities, let's say African Americans, Latinos again. And then you have the Asians providing services, right? And providing these commercial enterprises, like these small businesses, they're in the middle. And then, yeah, where are they in the middle of, though? They're in between the residents of that neighborhood again and large corporations that are not found in that neighborhood. So think, for example, of a big Walmart or Target or Vaughn's Grocery or Ralph's or what have you. When you go to these neighborhoods, um, and I'll be honest, I don't know about today in South Central, but certainly a few decades ago, this was true. These large corporations were not found in these economically depressed, low income neighborhoods. Why? It's because, upon doing some research in terms of whether they should invest some businesses, some chains, right, or some franchises maybe in the area, they determined that the neighborhood itself had very low income, right? There was little capital that could be spent if they did, in fact, invest in a store in that neighborhood. Moreover, I'm sure they looked into things like, the crime rates, right? The possibility of criminal activity and vandalism and theft and so forth. So they decide that not to open a place that wouldn't be lucrative to them. Okay, so in other words, you have this lack of resources, uh, actual goods, right? And a lot of these are necessities, right? Like food and so forth. So who's going to provide those basic goods in that neighborhood? Well, it turns out that another ethnic minority will step into that vacuum, if you will, and provide that neighborhood, which again is comprised of racial minorities, right? So you can see why the term minority is still used here, middleman minority, because the Koreans are still an ethnic minority, but then they're in between larger corporate America, like I said, and the actual residents of that low income neighborhood. Okay, so that's what happens. Basically, the middleman minority, they cater products and goods and really basic necessities, but some of them are not basic necessities, like, liquor, right? Liquor stores. But they provide all these goods to low income minorities. And these goods are in a middle class neighborhood found with large corporations again. But in the so-called ghetto areas, if you will, again, these big grocery chains, for example, do not invest large stores due to what I just explained, the low spending capacity of the residents. Okay, so therefore, these residents depend on that small grocery. Now, the middleman minority, when it came to Koreans and let's say African Americans, especially during the 90s, the 80s and 90s, when they started coming in there in larger numbers, the Koreans, that is, it led to ethnic friction and antagonism. What caused this? Well, Koreans felt that, African Americans were disrespectful to them, and they felt like they were stealing, right? On the other hand, you see African Americans complaining that, they were not friendly to them, them as customers, that they're always treating them with suspiciousness, that they were rude to them, and so on and so forth. Okay, and a lot of it, you have to say, is cultural misunderstanding, perhaps flowing both ways. Okay, so there is this ethnic tension. And by the way, there's movies that come out in the 90s that reflect this tension. There's a movie called Boys in the Hood, that talks about Asian, businesses. There's a movie called Menace to Society that reflects this. Another movie is Do the Right Thing by the director Spike Lee. It takes place in New York, but they depict that Korean grocer or the Asian grocer there, and the ethnic tension. But if you know anything about the Los Angeles riots that erupt in 1991, right before the Los Angeles riots, there was, of course, all this tension between Koreans and African Americans, especially. Now, the Rodney King riot, the LA riots, was due to, the beating of Rodney King. In case you didn't know, he was beaten by police, LAPD, and the police were basically found not guilty. They were acquitted of all charges. So this erupted into a riot because there was video evidence of this, but nonetheless, the jury found them um, innocent. So what happens here is African American rioters and looters, they took their anger out towards many Korean business owners. Okay, so in fact, I believe more than half of the damages, millions, tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, were suffered by Koreans. And obviously, Koreans have nothing to do with the Rodney King case, right? It's just my whole point is their anger is being unleashed and directed towards Koreans. Now, I don't want to overstate the degree to which there's ethnic friction, as if there's no gray area. What some Koreans try to do is hire some African Americans to work there. At the same time, you had African Americans who were friendly with some Koreans, who were actual friends. You had African Americans defending Korean stores, trying to stave off the rioters, say, hey, I know this place, I've been going here for years. They're good people. Don't loot the place. Don't burn the place down. So, but nonetheless, in a general sense, it was, a really tense scene, to say the least. And afterwards, you see, this movement to try to mend fences between both sides of the people in the neighborhood. Now, um, you can also begin to talk about another group called, or who are, the South Asian immigrants. Now, the preponderance of this immigration flow is coming from India, almost all of it. Okay, but to a lesser degree, there are Pakistanis, Bangladesh, Sri Lankans, and Nepalese. And of course, this is South Asia, right? Now, just like the Koreans, which numbered a few thousands before World War II, working in the fields, the agribusiness of the West Coast, so too were some South Asians, Punjabis to be more accurate, who worked in agribusiness, but they were very small in number, numbering maybe a few thousand. But again, it's the 1965 Immigration Act that will lead to an explosion. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. Okay, it's going to take a few decades for South Asians, for their migratory numbers to inflate. But certainly by the 2000s and 2010s, the past decade, uh, South Asian immigration just explodes. Now, in fact, just in the last decade, they rose to become the second largest immigrant group from Asia. Okay, before in the 2010 census, it was Filipinos who occupied that rank. By the way, the largest was Chinese, right? But today, it's Chinese still, number one, and then South Asians, or Indians to be specific, and then Filipinos third. Okay, so that just indicates the explosion again in the last decade of Indian migrants coming over here. Now, one thing that's interesting about the South Asian is because, well, if you recall the 1965 Immigration Act, there's those preferential categories targeting professionals and the educated, right? Well, Indians are going to take advantage of this. Um, in particular, in the United States, those industries such as the high tech sector, let's say research, right? Scientific research, for example, Scripps, right? Scripps Institute, something like that, right? Uh, these occupations and professions that involve a lot of training, high education, and even experience. Well, what these um, places are going to do, what these industries are going to do, is try to recruit workers from abroad. Right? Why do they do this? It's because, well, it amounts to the same thing we discussed before 1965. It's cheap labor. Now, to be sure, it's not or it is no longer cheap, unskilled labor, like we talked about, for example, with the Chinese railroad workers or the Filipino workers in the West during the Great Depression. They're skilled workers, obviously. In fact, they're professionals. They're highly trained, and most of them with a good amount of experience. However, it is t- it is still cheap labor because they're being paid less than the American worker. Okay, for a lot of these corporations or these industries, technological industries, it costs less to pay the salary of an immigrant from India, for example, an engineer from India. It costs less to pay him or her compared to, let's say, an American with a degree from UCLA, right? So it is still cheap labor. Now, this right here, this H-1B visa, right? H-1B visas are really a big part of the story. H-1B visa workers are basically temporary workers who are contractual, right? They agree to work for a particular industry that recruits them for temporary tenure, right? In other words, not permanent. Uh, they're temporary workers. And they're paid well, but again, they're paid less than the American worker. All right, but they're still professional, as I mentioned. Okay, so technicians, engineers, scientists, so forth from India are attracted here. Now, of course, they're going to use chain migration to petition their relatives. So, what may follow the initial immigrant are relatives, and they may not be uh, as educated and experienced and trained as the initial immigrants. So they'll go on to occupy other labor markets, right? Other parts of the segments, like maybe unskilled labor, right? And they'll also serve as, in some cases, that middleman minority. Okay. Many Indians decide to open their own businesses or they're associated with a particular economic niche. For example, the motel industry in the United States, right? Many of them um, are owned by South Asians, right? And you may wonder, how did that happen? Well, it was basically a niche that was fulfilled, right, by Indians because there was this market for it, and they went on to take advantage of that to the point where today, and if you I know in Southern California, almost every hotel or motel you go to, it's run by Indian persons, right? Okay, so they're also linked to that middleman minority too, in many cases. But you can see how globalization is part of this. Let me repeat the global restructuring. What happens here is the industrial workforce that used to be in Detroit, that used to be in Pittsburgh or what have you, industrial places, Chicago, that is no longer the case. These corporations actually go outside the nation. They're now transnational, and they find the cheapest industrial labor force in whatever country they could find: Nicaragua, Honduras, Philippines, Thailand, what have you. Excuse me. Yet at the same time, our economy transitions from an industrial society because what I just mentioned, it transitions towards a service economy. And what's happening here are these service industries attracting labor. And as I mentioned, it's no longer just purely unskilled labor coming from Asia. There's skilled labor. Okay, so now you can see how all this stuff fits together with globalization and the 1965 Act. The 1965 Act opened doors, or opened avenues to allow for, let's say, professionals as well as family reunification. And you put that together with the change in the economy towards attracting professional classes, okay, and that's going to lead to a different type of immigrant. Now, I got to emphasize this: it's not all professional, Okay, post 1965 is not all professional, but much of it is. Again, with Filipinos and Filipino nurses, for example, if you go to a hospital or the healthcare industry in general, that's sort of an economic niche for them, just like the motel industry is an economic niche for Indian immigrants and their children, the next generation. So it's interesting to note how these different immigrants find their economic niche, and you could actually call this ethnic capital, was the term used, right? Is when they actually come here and they fulfill a labor shortage because there's a shortage of nurses in the United States. They fulfill that. They're paid less than the American nurse, right? At least in the beginning. And but when you compare it to their income in their home country, it's a lot more. So that provides incentive for them to come over. All right. And then from here, you see chain migration, right? You see this original immigrant perhaps deciding to become a resident, and then they might marry, and then they have children, and they're now American citizens, and then that original immigrant may become a citizen eventually, and they can petition family members, and then along comes the sibling, the parents, and then they're going to do the same thing. So it's this multiplier effect again. All right. Okay, so that ends the discussion in contemporary Asian America.